The wind was a mean thing that evening, a brute that shouldered its way down the single muddy street of Redemption, Wyoming, rattling the saloon's windows in their frames. It carried the iron-cold smell of rain and the vast, lonesome scent of the plains. Gideon Kane sat at a table in the corner, away from the handful of dusty cattlemen and the lone trapper nursing a beer at the bar. He had been waiting for 2 hours, and the waiting had scraped his nerves raw. He was not a man built for saloons. The air, thick with the ghosts of stale whiskey and cheap cigars, felt heavy in his lungs. His hands, broad and calloused from a lifetime of wrestling with leather, rope, and the unyielding land, looked strange wrapped around a glass of rye he had yet to finish. Everything about him was weathered and hard-won. His face was a map of sun and wind, with lines etched around eyes the color of a stormy sky. He was 34 years old but felt ancient, hollowed out by a silence that had taken root in his ranch house 2 winters back and had never left. Tonight, he was buying a solution to a problem, a temporary, complicated, and deeply unsettling solution. The problem was Nathan Bryce, a man whose ambition was as wide and rapacious as the territory itself. Bryce wanted the northern stretch of Gideon's land, the part with the deep well and the summer grass, and he was using the impending arrival of the railroad assessors as leverage. A single man, the whispers in town went, was a man who might sell, who might not have the roots to fight. A family man, however, was a different creature entirely. A man with a wife was a man building a future, a dynasty. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie the railroad men from back east would understand. So Gideon had sent a letter, through a discreet lawyer in Cheyenne, to an agency that dealt in such matters. His request was specific and brutal in its simplicity. A woman to act as his wife. Payment was generous. The terms were for 1 night, just long enough to sign the papers with the assessors tomorrow, to present a united front. After that, she would be gone, with the other half of her money and an annulment agreement already drawn up. It was a business transaction, clean and cold. He had told himself that 100 times, but sitting here, with the wind howling like a banshee, it felt like anything but. He watched the door, his jaw tight. What kind of woman would answer such an ad? He pictured someone hard-faced and calculating, a woman whose eyes held the same mercenary glint he saw in the mirror some mornings. He braced himself for her arrival, for the sordid charade they were about to perform. Then the door swung open, and she was there. She was nothing like he had imagined. The wind swept in with her, plastering a thin gray dress to her slender frame. She clutched a worn carpetbag in one hand and held the other at her throat, as if to keep the collar of her dress from strangling her. Her hair, the color of dried corn silk, was escaping its pins, damp tendrils clinging to her pale cheeks. She paused just inside the doorway, her gaze sweeping the room with a practiced stillness, the kind of stillness that comes from being watched too often. Her eyes found him. They were large and exhausted, the color of faded denim, and they held no artifice, no calculation. They held only a profound and weary sorrow. She was younger than he expected, maybe 25, but she carried herself with the gravity of someone much older. Gideon felt an unwelcome and unfamiliar pang of something that was not quite pity, but close to it. He stood, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. She walked toward him, her steps measured. The saloon had fallen quiet, the way a field hushes just before a storm breaks. Every eye was on her. She did not falter. When she reached his table, she did not sit. "Mr. Kane," her voice was low and hoarser than he expected, as if she had not used it much that day. "I am," he said, his own voice sounding rough in the sudden silence. She nodded once, a small, bird-like motion. "I am Clara Wynne." He gestured to the chair opposite him. She sat, placing her bag on the floor beside her. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her back straight. She did not look at the curious faces around them. She looked only at him, her expression unreadable. "You had a long ride?" he said. It was a foolish thing to say, a statement of the obvious. "The mail wagon is not built for comfort," she replied. And for the first time, a flicker of something sharp, something that might have once been wit, touched her voice. He cleared his throat. It was best to get to it. "The terms are as we agreed in the letters. You will be paid half now, half in the morning. The preacher is waiting. We sign the papers tomorrow at noon. After that, you are free to go. The annulment is already prepared." He watched her face for any sign of hesitation, of regret, of a last-minute attempt to bargain. There was none. Her gaze was steady, her hands perfectly still in her lap. The weight of all she had lost, a husband, a home, a life, had pressed the fight out of her. All that was left was a brittle kind of dignity. "Just one night," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but the words hung in the air between them, a promise and a boundary. It was not a question. It was a confirmation of the grim reality they both accepted. She was not expecting kindness, or conversation, or anything more than the cold, hard currency that would see her through another month. Hunger was a powerful motivator, and debt was a cruel master. Gideon knew that as well as anyone. "Just one night," he confirmed. He laid a small, heavy pouch of coins on the table. Her eyes flickered down to it, then back up to his face. She did not reach for it. He pushed it closer to her, slowly, as if it might burn her. She picked it up and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. The deal was sealed. The preacher's name was Reverend Michael, a thin, stooped man with a kind face and eyes that had seen too much of the hardship that defined life in the territory. He met them at the back door of the small clapboard church, sparing them the walk through the main sanctuary. His back room was cluttered, smelling of beeswax and old paper. A single lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, which were lined with shelves of worn books. The ceremony was a stark and silent affair. The preacher's wife, a stout woman named Martha, stood as the sole witness, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her gaze fixed on a dark spot on the floor. She did not look at them. Clara stood a full foot away from Gideon, her arms stiff at her sides. He could feel the tension coming off her in waves, a silent, desperate plea to get this over with. The Reverend's voice was a low murmur as he read the words from his book, the familiar passages about love and honor and cherishing sounding like a foreign language in the cramped, dim room. When it came time for the vows, their voices were barely audible, swallowed by the rising howl of the wind outside. They did not exchange rings. They did not touch. When the Reverend finally said, "I now pronounce you man and wife," the silence that followed was heavier than any words. No one clapped. No one offered congratulations. Martha slipped out of the room without a sound. Gideon paid the Reverend, the clink of coins seeming unnaturally loud. The preacher signed the certificate with a scratchy pen, the ink bleeding slightly on the cheap paper. He slid it across the desk toward Gideon. It was done. They were legally bound, strangers tied together by a lie. The ride to the ranch was worse than the wait in the saloon. They sat side by side on the wagon bench, the storm finally breaking around them. Rain came down in cold, driving sheets, and flashes of lightning lit up the landscape in ghostly white, revealing a world of rock and scrub and endless, empty space. The horse strained against the mud, the wheels of the wagon sucking and groaning with every turn. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions and the shared weight of their grim bargain. Gideon kept his eyes on the trail, his knuckles white on the reins. He could feel her beside him, shivering in her thin dress. He had an old wool blanket behind the seat, but he could not bring himself to offer it to her. The gesture felt too intimate, a kindness that would muddy the clean, cold lines of their arrangement. His ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a low rise of hills. The house was dark, a solid, lonely shape against the churning sky. It was a good house, built of sturdy timber he had cut and hauled himself. But it was not a home, not anymore. Inside, he lit a lantern and then moved to the stone fireplace, his actions methodical and practiced. He had the fire going in minutes, the flames licking at the dry kindling and casting a warm, flickering light across the main room. The room was sparse and clean. A large wooden table, a few chairs, a bookshelf filled with his father's old books, and a rocking chair, sitting empty by the hearth. Sarah's chair. He deliberately did not look at it. He turned to Clara. She stood near the door, water dripping from the hem of her dress onto the wooden floor. She looked small and lost, her eyes wide as she took in the room. "There is stew on the stove," he said, his voice gruff. "And bread. You should eat." She nodded, but did not move. "The guest room is upstairs. It is clean." For the first time since they had met, her eyes flashed with something other than weariness. It was a flicker of defiance, of fear. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I will not sleep in the house." He frowned, not understanding. "There is nowhere else. The storm is getting worse." "The barn," she said, her chin lifting slightly. "There must be a loft. I will be fine in the barn." He stared at her, baffled. The barn was dry, but it was still a barn. The house offered a soft bed, warmth. He could not comprehend her refusal. But then he looked at her again, really looked at her, and he saw the fear that lay beneath the defiance. The house was too close, too personal. It was his space, sleeping under his roof. Even in a separate room was a line she would not cross. The barn was neutral territory. It kept the transaction clean. He felt a surge of something that might have been anger, or maybe just a deep, abiding weariness with the whole sorry business. "As you wish," he said. His voice clipped. He took a plate, filled it with a generous portion of beef stew and a thick slice of bread, and handed it to her. He then fetched a spare lantern and a pile of clean, heavy blankets from a chest by the door. "The loft is on the right. The ladder is sturdy," he said, his tone flat. He did not offer to escort her. He simply opened the door, letting in another blast of wind and rain, and watched as she slipped out into the night. A small, determined figure bent against the storm. He shut the door, the latch clicking into place with a sound of finality. He was alone again in the silent house. But now, the silence was different. It was heavier, charged with the knowledge of the woman sleeping just 100 feet away. Neither of them slept. In the house, Gideon sat in the dark, the fire long since burned down to glowing embers. He could not bring himself to go upstairs to his own bed, to the room that held the ghost of his wife. Sarah. Her name was a wound that would not heal. He remembered her laughter, how it used to fill every corner of this house. He remembered her hands, always busy, sewing, gardening, baking. He remembered the hope in her eyes when she told him she was with child, a hope that had slowly, cruelly curdled into despair after the miscarriage. And then he remembered the silence, the terrible, growing silence of her last few months. He had tried to reach her, but she had walled herself away in a fortress of grief he could not breach. He remembered that winter morning, 2 years ago, the unnatural stillness of the house when he woke. He remembered calling her name, the rising panic in his chest. He remembered finding her in the well, her face pale beneath the icy water. The memory was a physical blow, stealing his breath, leaving him cold and shaking in the dark. The wind howled around the eaves, and it sounded like a scream. In the barn, Clara lay in the hayloft, wrapped tightly in the wool blankets. The smell of the hay was sweet and earthy, and the sound of the rain drumming on the roof was a steady, rhythmic beat. But there was no comfort to be found. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside her. Her eyes were wide open, staring up into the darkness. She was not thinking of the stranger in the house, or the humiliating bargain she had made. She was thinking of Thomas, her son, a small boy with his father's dark curls and her own serious blue eyes. She remembered the weight of him in her arms, the milky scent of his skin. After her husband died in a mining collapse, she had moved them to a bigger town, taking work as a seamstress in a dress shop. The hours were long, the pay was meager, and the owner's wife watched her like a hawk. Thomas had been sick with a fever. She'd had to leave him with a neighbor while she worked, stitching endless seams for wealthy women who would never know her name. She remembered the guilt that had gnawed at her, the desperate need to be with him. She had come home one evening, her fingers raw and her pay in her pocket, to find the neighbor weeping on the porch. The fever had taken him. Just like that. She had not even been there to hold his hand. The memory was a shard of glass in her heart, and with every beat, it cut deeper. The wind rattled the barn doors, and it sounded like a child crying in the night. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the tears came anyway, silent and hot against her cold skin. Dawn broke gray and weeping. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving a sodden, quiet world in its wake. Gideon was in the kitchen, stoking the fire in the cook stove, when the door opened. Clara stood there, looking pale and hollowed out in the dim morning light. Her hair was neatly pinned, and her dress was damp but tidy. She had brought the empty plate and the blankets, folded neatly. He did not know what to say. "Good morning," felt like a lie. He gestured toward the stove. "Coffee is almost ready." She nodded and set the blankets on a chair. They stood in an uneasy silence, on opposite sides of the room, listening to the fire crackle and the coffee percolate. The air was thick with the things they had not said, with the ghosts that had kept them both awake. She was the first to speak, her voice flat. "The deal is done. I will take the rest of my payment and be on my way." He looked at her, then turned and poured 2 cups of coffee, the liquid black and steaming. He handed one to her. Their fingers brushed. A brief, accidental contact that felt like a spark of lightning. They both pulled back at the same time. He took a sip of his coffee, the bitter heat a welcome jolt. He walked to the window and looked out. The rain had stopped, but the devastation was clear. The small creek that ran along the edge of his property was now a churning, muddy river. Twice its normal size, it had spilled its banks, swallowing the trail that led back to town. The road was gone, washed away into a sea of thick, impassable mud. He turned from the window, his face grim. He met her tired, expectant gaze. "The road's washed out," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are not going anywhere." Clara stared at him, the cup of coffee trembling slightly in her hand. He saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, quickly suppressed. She looked past him, out the window, and saw the truth of his words for herself. She closed her eyes for a long moment, a silent sigh escaping her lips. It was the sigh of a woman who had long ago learned not to fight the inevitable. She opened her eyes and looked at him. "I will stay," she said, her voice a quiet statement of fact. "Until the road clears." Gideon said nothing. He just nodded and took another long drink of his coffee. He did not argue. The West had a way of making its own plans, and they were all just caught in the current. The days that followed were made of mud and silence. The sky remained a bruised, sullen gray, and the earth refused to heal. The road to town was a memory, a long, soupy scar of brown muck that Gideon said would take another week of sun to bake hard enough for a wagon. So they existed in a state of suspension, 2 strangers trapped on an island of damp earth, surrounded by a sea of mud. A rhythm established itself, unspoken and unnegotiated. Clara claimed the kitchen as her territory. She had moved her things from the barn into the small guest room upstairs on the second day, a silent concession to practicality that felt like a seismic shift in their arrangement. Gideon had said nothing when he saw her worn carpet bag at the top of the stairs, but that evening he found she had left a plate of hot food for him on the table. covered with another plate to keep it warm, before she retreated to her room. She was a quiet but constant presence in the house. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life spent in tight spaces, never wasting a step. She found a sack of flour and a canister of yeast and began to bake bread. The scent, warm and wholesome, filled the house, a ghost of a memory of what a home should smell like. It was a scent Gideon had not smelled in 2 years, and it ambushed him, leaving him with an ache in his chest so profound he had to step outside into the damp air. His hands clenched at his sides. She cooked, he worked. He would rise before dawn, his heavy boots echoing on the floorboards, and be gone for hours, returning only when the sun was high. He spent his days resetting fence posts heaved up by the wet ground, clearing debris washed down from the hills, and tending to his small herd of cattle, who were restless and miserable in the persistent damp. They barely spoke. Their conversations were clipped and necessary. Exchanges of information about the weather, the state of the road, the dwindling supply of coffee. The creek is still too high. There is one more jar of peaches in the cellar. It looks like it might clear by evening. Yet, in the vast spaces of their silence, they began to notice things. Gideon became aware of her as a sound, a presence that had altered the very air in his house, the soft whisk of her broom in the mornings, the gentle clink of a spoon against a bowl. Once, he heard her humming, a low, tuneless melody that seemed to come from a place of deep memory. The sound was so unexpected, so fundamentally out of place in the grim quiet he was used to, that he stopped in the doorway, his hand on the latch, and just listened. The humming stopped abruptly, as if she sensed him there, and the silence that rushed back in felt heavier than before. He watched her from a distance. He saw the way she startled at loud noises. A log shifting and collapsing in the fireplace would make her jump, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes wide with a fleeting, animal fear. When he came in one afternoon and dropped an armload of firewood into the box by the hearth with a loud clatter, she flinched so violently she dropped the potato she was peeling. She bent to retrieve it without a word, her face averted, but he saw the tremor in her hands. He had meant nothing by it, but he found himself moving more quietly around the house after that, setting things down with a care he had not known he possessed. Clara, in turn, began to see the cracks in his hardened exterior. She saw the deep weariness in his shoulders when he came in at the end of the day, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the empty rocking chair by the fire, his expression becoming distant and bleak. She learned the sound of his footsteps, the heavy, measured tread of a man walking a long, lonely road. One evening, after the meager meal they shared in silence, he took his rifle from the pegs on the wall and began to clean it. It was a ritual she had seen him perform twice before, a methodical, focused task. He worked with an expert's familiarity, his large, calloused hands breaking down the weapon, cleaning each part with an oiled rag, his movements precise and economical. She sat at the table, mending a tear in his work shirt, an act she had undertaken without asking, simply because she could not bear to sit with idle hands. When he was finished, he reassembled the rifle and set it back on its pegs. He stood there for a moment, his back to her, and she saw it, a fine, violent trembling in his hands. He seemed to be staring at them, as if they belonged to another man. He quickly balled them into fists, the knuckles turning white, and the shaking stopped. He turned away from the wall, but not before she saw the look on his face, a flash of self-disgust, of raw, impotent anger at a weakness he could not control. He did not know she had seen. He walked out onto the porch without a word, into the deepening twilight. She sat perfectly still, the needle frozen in her hand, the silence of the room filled with the echo of his invisible wound. The sun finally came out on the 5th day. The world seemed to steam, the land releasing a week's worth of trapped moisture into the air. The mud began to dry, cracking and hardening into a treacherous, rutted surface. Gideon announced that he needed to move the cattle to the higher pasture before they ruined the lower fields entirely. It was a two-man job, but he was one man, so he would have to make do. He left at dawn. Clara watched him go from the kitchen window, a solitary figure on his dark bay horse, whistling to his dog, a scruffy brown creature named Buck, to bring up the rear of the small herd. She spent the day in a flurry of domestic activity, washing sheets, scrubbing floors, beating dust from the single rug in the main room. She worked with a frantic energy, trying to outrun the thoughts that crowded her mind. The thought that this was beginning to feel too much like a life, a dangerous illusion she could not afford to entertain. By late afternoon, a knot of anxiety had formed in her stomach. He should have been back hours ago. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in brilliant, bloody strokes of orange and red. She scanned the hills, her eyes straining for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the vast, empty sweep of the land and the long shadows stretching out like grasping fingers. She could not wait any longer. She was not sure what she could do, but the thought of sitting in the house, waiting in the encroaching darkness, was unbearable. She pulled on a heavy coat of his that she found hanging by the door, the sleeves ridiculously long, the wool smelling of him, of leather and wood smoke and sweat, and set out. Following the tracks of the herd, she found him a mile from the house. His horse, Apollo, was grazing peacefully, the reins trailing on the ground. The dog, Buck, was sitting faithfully beside Gideon's still form, letting out a soft whine when he saw her approach. Gideon was lying on his side, his face pale, a dark bruise already forming on his temple. His left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She knelt beside him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Gideon?" she said, her voice a thin, reedy sound. She touched his shoulder, then shook him gently. He did not stir. For one terrible moment, she was back in another room, in another life, touching another still form that would not wake. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the wave of nausea and grief. No, not again. She forced herself to be calm, to think. She felt for a pulse in his neck. It was there, slow but steady. A breath shuddered out of her. He was alive. She looked at his arm. It was clearly broken, the wrist already beginning to swell. She had to get him back to the house. She was not a strong woman, but desperation lent her a strength she did not know she possessed. She managed to get him to a sitting position, his head lolling against her shoulder. He groaned, a low sound of pain, and his eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, clouded with confusion. "Sarah," he mumbled, his voice thick. The name was a slap. Clara flinched, pulling back slightly. "No," she said, her own voice sharper than she intended. "It is Clara. You have had a fall." Recognition slowly dawned in his eyes, followed by a grimace of pain as he tried to move. She helped him to his feet, his full weight leaning heavily against her. It was a slow, agonizing journey back to the ranch, half carrying, half dragging him. By the time they reached the porch, night had fallen, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She got him inside and onto his bed, the first time she had set foot in his bedroom. It was as sparse and functional as the rest of the house, dominated by a large, sturdy bed frame he had likely built himself. She lit a lamp and turned to examine the damage. There was a long, shallow cut on his temple, still oozing blood, and his wrist was a swollen, discolored mess. She worked with a grim efficiency, her earlier reluctance burned away by the urgency of the situation. She found clean cloths and a basin of water and gently cleaned the cut on his head. He hissed in pain when she touched it, but did not pull away. Setting the wrist was a cruder affair. She found 2 flat pieces of wood from the kindling box and tore strips from a clean sheet for bandages. "This is going to hurt," she warned, her voice flat. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes squeezed shut. She pulled, hard, until she felt the grating shift of bone. He cried out, a sharp, strangled sound, and then his head fell back against the pillow. His face beaded with sweat. She bound the splint as tightly as she could, her hands surprisingly steady. For the next 3 days, she was his nurse. At first, she performed her duties with a resentful grumble, muttering under her breath about how this was not part of their agreement, how she should be on her way to Cheyenne. He was a difficult patient, proud and stubborn, refusing to ask for help even when he clearly needed it. He tried to get out of bed on the second day, a fever brought on by the injury making him unsteady on his feet. He swayed, and would have fallen if she had not been there to catch him. "Get back in that bed, you fool!" she snapped, surprised at her own ferocity. She pushed him back onto the mattress with more force than was necessary. He fell back, too weak to argue, and glared at her from the pillows. But as the days passed, something shifted. Her initial resentment softened into a quiet attentiveness. She saw him not as the hard, intimidating rancher who had hired her, but as a man, helpless and in pain. She brought him broth, holding the spoon to his lips when he was too weak to lift it himself. She kept a cool cloth on his forehead to fight the fever. She sat in a chair by his bed, her mending in her lap, a silent guardian in the quiet, sick-scented room. He was vulnerable, stripped of his formidable strength, and in his vulnerability, she saw a reflection of her own. His defenses were down, and so, she found, were hers. The wall she had so carefully constructed around her heart began to crumble, brick by silent brick. On the evening of the 3rd day, his fever finally broke. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. The silence in the room felt different, less tense, almost comfortable. The lantern on the bedside table cast a warm, golden glow, pushing the shadows into the corners. Clara had found a book on one of the shelves in the main room, a worn volume of poetry by Mr. Longfellow. She had been reading it to herself, her lips moving silently. "Read it out loud," he said, his voice raspy. She looked up, startled. "What?" "The book," he said, nodding toward it. "My mother used to read to me when I was sick." "Read it out loud." She hesitated. The request felt intimate, a step across a line they had not yet approached. But then she looked at his face, pale in the lamplight, and she found she could not refuse. She opened the book and began to read. Her voice was soft at first, uncertain, but it grew stronger as she lost herself in the rhythm of the words, in the tales of distant shores and historical deeds. She read for nearly an hour. The only sound in the room was her voice and the soft sigh of the wind outside. When she finally paused and looked over at him, his eyes were closed, his breathing slow and even. She thought he was asleep. She quietly closed the book, preparing to retreat to her own room. "Do not stop," he said, his eyes still closed. She looked at him, surprised. He was not asleep. He was listening. She opened the book again and continued to read. When she finished the poem, she did not start another. She just sat in the quiet, the book resting in her lap. "My wife," he said, his voice low and rough, coming out of the shadows. Her name was Sarah. Clara's hands tightened on the book. She waited, not breathing. The miscarriage. It broke something inside her. She would sit in that rocking chair for hours, just staring at nothing. I tried to talk to her. I tried to hold her. It was like holding a handful of smoke. She was just gone, long before she walked out to the well. He fell silent for a long moment, and Clara could hear the raw, ragged edge of his grief in the quiet. They say she drowned. That is what the Reverend put in the records. But it was not an accident. She filled her pockets with rocks from the creek bed. She made sure. The confession hung in the air, heavy and terrible. It was a truth he had carried alone for 2 years, a poison he had swallowed every single day. Clara felt her own carefully guarded grief rising up to meet his. The story she had kept locked away for so long pushed at her lips, demanding to be spoken, to be shared. "My son," she whispered, the words tasting like rust in her mouth. "His name was Thomas. He was 4 years old." She took a shaky breath. "His father was dead. I was working in a sewing shop. 12 hours a day. He took a fever. I had to leave him with a neighbor. I had to work. We needed the money for food, for rent." Her voice broke, and a single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek. "I came home, and he was gone. He died while I was sewing lace onto a gown for a rich woman's party. He died alone." They sat in the thick, shared silence of their grief. Their separate, secret pains were now a single, tangible thing in the room with them. Gideon slowly, painfully, pushed himself up with his good arm. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused against hers, but his touch was gentle. She looked down at their joined hands. She should pull away. She should get up and leave the room, retreat back behind her walls, but she did not. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel entirely alone. Neither of them pulled away. A week later, the road was finally dry. The world was clean and bright, washed new by the storm. Gideon's arm was healing, his strength slowly returning. They were eating breakfast, the familiar silence between them now comfortable, when they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. It was Reverend Michael. He tipped his hat to Clara as he approached the porch. "Mrs. Kane," he said, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good to see you looking well. And you, Gideon. I heard about your accident. I'm glad to see you on your feet." "Reverend," Gideon acknowledged with a nod. The preacher cleared his throat, a look of gentle awkwardness on his face. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I came as soon as the road was clear," he said, holding the paper out to Clara. "This is the annulment agreement. It just needs your signature. I can file it for you when I get back to town." The paper was a stark white rectangle in the morning sun. It was her freedom, her ticket out, the end of the deal, everything she had thought she wanted. Clara looked from the paper to the Reverend's expectant face, and then to Gideon. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, his stormy eyes giving nothing away. He would not ask her to stay. His pride would not allow it. The choice was hers alone. She took the papers from the Reverend. Her hands were steady. "Thank you, Reverend," she said, her voice quiet but clear. She looked down at the legal words, the clean lines that would erase the past 2 weeks, that would make her a stranger to this man and this place. Then, slowly and deliberately, she tore the paper in half, and then in half again. The pieces fluttered from her fingers and danced on the dusty porch boards, small white flags of surrender, or perhaps of a new beginning. She looked up and met Gideon's gaze, a flicker of something, surprise, relief, hope, stirred in the depths of his eyes. "It seems my wife will be staying." "Reverend," Gideon said, his voice holding a new note of warmth that Clara had never heard before. The tearing of the annulment papers was a silent declaration, a line drawn in the dust of the porch. In the days that followed, the air in the small ranch house shifted. The quiet between Gideon and Clara was no longer the tense, brittle silence of strangers, but something softer, a shared space of unspoken understanding. They still moved around each other with a careful sort of gravity, but now there was a thread of connection, thin and fragile, but undeniably there. The real world, however, lay just a few miles down the newly hardened road, and it had not forgotten them. A week after the preacher's visit, their supplies were running low. There was no avoiding a trip to town. Gideon loaded the wagon, his movements stiff and deliberate with his still mending arm. Clara took her seat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, a familiar knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She had spent the last 2 years of her life trying to be invisible. Now, she was about to be seen, Redemption was a different town from the one she had arrived in during the storm. Then, it had been a place of shadows and hurried glances. Now, under the bold, unforgiving light of a late spring morning, it was a place of judgment. As Gideon guided the wagon down the main street, Clara felt the weight of eyes upon her. Women sweeping their porches paused, their brooms still, their gazes sharp and dissecting. Men lounging outside the saloon stopped their talk, their eyes lingering on her with a lazy, speculative curiosity. The silence they left in their wake was louder than any shout. Inside the general store, the air was thick with it. Mr. Abernathy, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression, greeted Gideon with his usual gruff courtesy, but his eyes slid past Clara as if she were made of glass. Two women standing by the fabric bolts, Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Hemlock, the town's foremost purveyors of gossip, fell silent the moment they entered. They turned their backs, but not before Clara saw the shared, knowing sneer on their faces. She could almost hear the words they were whispering. Hired saloon girl, not a proper wife. Each unspoken word was a small, sharp stone, pelting her carefully constructed composure. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the list of supplies in her hand: flour, sugar, coffee, salt. She moved through the store with her head held high, but she could feel the blush creeping up her neck, hot and shameful. She was acutely aware of her dress, a simple brown calico she had mended herself. It felt plain and poor under the critical eyes of the townswomen. Gideon saw it all. He saw the leers from the men, the contempt from the women. A muscle worked in his jaw, a storm gathering in his gray eyes. He moved to stand closer to Clara, a solid, unmovable presence at her side, when a young cowhand tipped his hat to her with an insolent grin. Gideon's look was so cold and hard the boy's smile faltered, and he shuffled away, suddenly finding the toes of his boots fascinating. Gideon did not say a word, but his message was clear. She was with him. She was to be respected. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent ordeal. Clara stared straight ahead, her face a pale, still mask, but Gideon could feel the waves of humiliation coming off her. The beauty of the day, the wide blue sky, the greening plains, all seemed a mockery of the ugliness they had just endured. When the ranch finally came into view, a welcome sanctuary in the vast emptiness, Clara finally spoke. Her voice was low and brittle, stripped of all emotion. "I should leave," she said. Gideon pulled the wagon to a halt. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. "No." "You saw them," she continued, her voice gaining a slight tremor. "You heard what they did not say. I am bringing shame to you, to your name. I am not the kind of wife a man like you should have." Her hands were twisting the fabric of her dress in her lap. "I am used to walking away. It is what I do. It is better for everyone." He turned then, and his eyes, fierce and direct, pinned her. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just looked at her, at the deep, weary pain in her eyes, at the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. Then, "Stop," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a command. "Stop walking away." She stared at him. Her lips parted in surprise. It was the last thing she had expected him to say. She had expected agreement, perhaps a quiet, regretful acceptance of the inevitable. But not this simple, stubborn refusal to let her go. She had no answer for it. He clucked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward, the two words he had spoken echoing in the space between them. They arrived at the ranch to a strange sight. A wagon was already there, hitched near the porch. A woman sat on the steps, her shoulders slumped in a posture of utter exhaustion. It was Martha Swanson, whose ranch bordered theirs to the south. Her husband had died of a fever the previous winter, leaving her to manage the place alone with her two young sons. Gideon pulled up, his face etched with concern. "Martha, what is it? What is wrong?" Martha Swanson lifted her head, and her face was a ruin of grief. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen from weeping. "It is Elsie, Gideon," she choked out, her voice raw. "Elsie Miller, from down the valley. She died this morning." Clara felt a chill, despite the warmth of the sun. Elsie Miller was just a girl, barely 16. "She was with child," Martha continued, her voice breaking. "No one knew. She hid it. She gave birth last night, alone in their root cellar. Her PA found her this morning. The baby lived." Martha's gaze shifted, and for the first time, Clara noticed the bundle of flannel she was clutching in her lap. A soft, whimpering sound came from within it. "Her PA. He is a hard man. Gideon. He says the child is a product of sin. He will not have it in his house. He was going to just leave it. For the coyotes." The horror of the words hung in the still air. "I could not let him, but I cannot keep her. I have my own 2 boys. I have not got the time, or the milk, or the heart for another. I am barely holding on as it is." She looked from Gideon to Clara, her eyes pleading. "I did not know where else to go." She held the bundle out. It was a silent, desperate offering. Gideon stood frozen, his face a mask of stone. He took a half-step back, a reflexive, instinctive retreat. Clara saw the old, familiar pain flash in his eyes, the ghost of a memory, of a child he had also lost before it had a chance to live. But Clara stepped forward. She did not hesitate. She reached out and took the bundle from Martha's trembling arms. The weight of it was so slight, almost nothing. She pulled back a corner of the flannel. Inside was the tiniest, most fragile human being she had ever seen, a perfectly formed baby girl, her face red and wrinkled, her eyes squeezed shut. A little tuft of downy black hair crowned her head. The baby let out another soft cry, a sound that pierced Clara's heart like a needle. She held the child as if it were made of spun glass. Her arms, which had felt empty for so long, now ached with the familiar, forgotten weight of an infant. All the carefully constructed walls around her heart dissolved in that instant. All she saw was this tiny, helpless creature, abandoned on its first day in the world. "We will take her," Clara said, her voice surprisingly firm. She looked at Gideon, daring him to contradict her. "Clara, no," he said, his voice low and harsh. "This is not our concern. We are not equipped for this." "She will die if we do not," Clara retorted, her gaze unwavering. "Is that of no concern to you?" She clutched the baby closer to her chest, a fierce, protective instinct flaring to life within her. "We will care for her, at least for now, until we can find a proper home for her." Gideon stared at them, at this strange woman he barely knew, and the even stranger infant she held as if she had been born to do it. He saw the fierce determination in Clara's eyes, and he knew it was a battle he would not win. More than that, a part of him, a part he had thought long dead, did not want to win. He looked at the tiny, vulnerable life in Clara's arms, and the ice around his own heart cracked just a little. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of resignation, of defeat, of something else he could not yet name. He gave a single, curt nod. The baby's arrival shattered the fragile peace of the ranch. Her cries, thin and demanding, echoed through the small house at all hours, a constant reminder of their new, overwhelming reality. They had nothing for a baby. Clara fashioned diapers from old flour sacks and a bed from a wooden crate, padded with her own shawl. Gideon rode to the Swansons' place and came back with a milking goat, a stubborn, ill-tempered creature who provided the only nourishment they could offer. The child's presence reawakened the ghosts they both tried so hard to keep buried. For Gideon, every cry was a reminder of the cries he had never heard, of the cradle that had remained empty. He kept his distance, watching from doorways, a pained, haunted look on his face. He would not hold her. He would not even touch her. For Clara, it was a constant, bittersweet torture. Every time she held the baby, her body remembered the curve of the child's head in the crook of her arm, the faint, milky scent of her skin, the surprising strength in her tiny, grasping fingers. It all brought back a flood of memories of Thomas. The grief was a physical thing, a hollow ache in her chest that was sometimes so intense she had to hand the baby to Gideon, who would take her awkwardly, holding her at arm's length like a bomb that might explode, and flee to her room, stifling her sobs in her pillow. But alongside the grief, something else was taking root, a fragile, tentative hope, watching the baby sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling. Clara felt a flicker of purpose she had not felt in years. This small life depended on her. This small life was a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to fight. One night, the baby would not stop crying. She had been wailing for hours, a relentless, heartbreaking sound that frayed their nerves raw. Clara had walked her, rocked her, sung to her, but nothing worked. Gideon, who had been trying to read in the main room, finally came to the door of her bedroom. He looked exhausted, his face grim in the lamplight. "Let me take her," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. Clara, near tears herself, relinquished the screaming infant. Gideon began to pace the floor with the baby held against his shoulder, his large hand patting her back in a slow, steady rhythm. He walked and walked, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and slowly, miraculously, the baby's cries subsided into whimpers, and then, finally, into the soft, even breaths of sleep. He stood by the window, the sleeping child a small, warm weight against his shoulder. He did not seem to want to put her down. Clara watched him, her heart aching for him, for both of them. "Her crying," she began, her voice a near whisper. "It reminds me of another time, another child." Gideon turned from the window, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. The story spilled out of her then, a confession she had never made to another living soul. It was a story far older and more painful than the one about Thomas. "I was 17, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the worn floorboards. "I was a fool. I fell in love with a boy who made promises he never intended to keep. I gave birth to a son, all alone, in a rented room in a town where no one knew my name. The shame of it was still a fresh, hot thing, even after all these years. It was the middle of a terrible winter. The snow was so deep you could not see the roads. I had no money for firewood. I burned the chairs. I burned the table. I burned everything I had to keep him warm, but it was not enough." Her voice cracked, and she had to stop, swallowing against the lump in her throat. "One morning, I woke up, and he was just so quiet, so still, and so cold." She was sobbing now, great, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. The grief she had carried alone for a decade finally broke free. "He was not even a year old. He did not even have a name. I buried him myself, in the frozen ground behind the church. No one ever knew." Gideon gently laid the sleeping baby in the crate and crossed the room in 2 long strides. He knelt in front of her chair and, without a word, he pulled her into his arms. Clara collapsed against him, burying her face in his shoulder, her tears soaking his shirt. He did not offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. He just held her. He held her as she cried for the child with no name, for Thomas, for the woman she had once been, for the life she had lost. He just held her, his one good arm wrapped around her like a shield, and he did not let go. When her sobs finally subsided, she was limp and exhausted in his arms. She pulled back slightly, her face streaked with tears, her eyes swollen. He looked at her, his own eyes shining with an emotion she could not decipher. It was not pity. It was something deeper, something akin to recognition. He saw the broken pieces of her, and they matched the broken pieces of himself. He slowly raised his hand and cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. He leaned in, and their lips met. It was not a kiss of passion, of desire. It was a kiss of shared pain, of profound and sorrowful understanding. It was a quiet promise, made in the dark, that neither of them was entirely alone anymore. They stayed like that for a long time, in the quiet of the night, the sleeping baby breathing softly in the corner. At dawn, the first rays of sun slanted through the window, touching the small wooden crate. The baby stirred, making a soft, snuffling sound. Clara went to her and picked her up. The child opened her eyes, clear, dark little pools that seemed to reflect the morning sky. Gideon came to stand beside her. They looked down at the infant, who was now awake and calm, gazing up at them with a look of serene trust. "She needs a name," Clara said softly. Gideon looked at Clara, at the new, fragile light in her eyes. He looked at the baby, this small, improbable life that had forced its way into their broken world. "Hope," he said, his voice husky. "Her name is Hope." Clara looked up at him, a slow, watery smile spreading across her face. "Yes," she whispered. "It is a good name." Hope, as it turned out, was a demanding house guest. She transformed the quiet, ordered world of the ranch into a chaotic symphony of cries, gurgles, and the constant, pervasive scent of sour milk and clean flannel. The days took on a new shape, measured not by the sun's journey across the sky, but by the rhythm of the baby's needs. Clara found herself in a state of perpetual motion. Her life narrowed to the simple, elemental tasks of feeding, burping, and changing the tiny infant. Yet, in this exhaustion, she found a strange and unexpected contentment. The hollow spaces inside her, carved out by loss, were slowly being filled by the overwhelming, immediate reality of this new life. Gideon watched it all from a careful distance. The hard lines of his face would soften when he looked at the baby, a flicker of bewildered tenderness in his eyes. He still would not hold her for long, but Clara would often find him standing over the wooden crate, his large, calloused finger gently tracing the curve of the baby's cheek. He began to speak to Clara in a new way, asking quiet questions about the child. Did she eat well? Does she seem warm enough? They were building a life, not with grand pronouncements, but with the small, ordinary bricks of shared concern. The silence between them was now filled with the soft sounds of a baby's breath, and it was a more profound connection than words could ever have forged. This fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Clara was on the porch, rocking Hope in her arms and humming a soft lullaby, when she saw a rider approaching. He was not a neighbor. He rode a magnificent black stallion that was out of place among the sturdy ranch horses of the territory, and he sat in an expensive, silver-inlaid saddle. The man himself was dressed in a fine black coat and a clean, wide-brimmed hat. He looked like a predator, sleek and dangerous, and Clara felt an immediate, prickling sense of alarm. Gideon came out of the barn, wiping his good hand on his trousers, his face already settling into a hard, guarded mask. He recognized the rider, and the recognition was not a pleasant one. The man dismounted with a fluid, arrogant grace. He was handsome in a cruel sort of way, with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes as cold and flat as river stones. He took off his hat, revealing dark, oiled hair, and gave a shallow, mocking bow in Clara's direction. "Cain," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a sound that did not belong in the dusty ranch yard. "I see you have been busy acquiring assets." His gaze flickered to Hope, then lingered on Clara with an insolent appraisal that made her skin crawl. "What do you want, Bryce?" Gideon's voice was a low growl. He moved to stand slightly in front of Clara, a protective, unconscious gesture. "Nathan Bryce," the man said, turning his full attention to Gideon. "And what I want is what I have always wanted. The northern pasture, the one with the deep well. The railroad is making its final survey next month. That land will be worth a fortune. I am prepared to make you a final, generous offer." "The land is not for sale," Gideon said, his voice flat and final. Bryce smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. "Everything is for sale. Cain, it is just a matter of finding the right price or the right motivation." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a confidential, menacing tone. "Accidents happen out here. Fences get cut, cattle wander off or sicken. Barns, I have heard, can be quite flammable this time of year." The threat was naked, ugly. Clara clutched Hope tighter, her heart beginning to pound. "You set one foot on my land again, Bryce, and I will see you buried on it," Gideon said, his one good hand balling into a fist at his side. Bryce's smile widened. He seemed to be enjoying himself. "So protective, all for a woman who is not even your wife." The world seemed to stop. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "The whole town is talking," Bryce continued, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "About the mail-order bride, the hired wife, a woman of, shall we say, negotiable affection." He looked directly at Clara, his eyes full of contempt. "The land court takes a dim view of fraudulent claims. Mrs. Cain, or should I call you Miss Wynne? I have friends in Cheyenne. It would be a simple matter to look into your past. I wonder what they might find. A woman who signs a marriage certificate under false pretenses has no legal standing. The land would be considered the property of a single man, a man who might be more amenable to a sale." He had them. He had them trapped. He had found the one crack in their foundation and was preparing to shatter it. He put his hat back on, his point made. "You have until the end of the week to reconsider my offer," Bryce said. He mounted his horse, gave them one last triumphant sneer, and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and silent dread in his wake. The house felt cold and small after he was gone. The air was thick with unspoken fears. Gideon stood at the window, staring out at the land Bryce meant to steal, his shoulders rigid with a barely controlled rage. Clara laid the sleeping Hope in her crate and came to stand behind him. Her voice, when she spoke, was a dead, hollow thing. "I will leave in the morning." Gideon did not turn around. "We have been through this." "This is different," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "He knows. Gideon, he will ruin you. He will take this place from you. All because of me. I told you I bring shame. I bring trouble." This was the story of her life. A long, sad tale of causing ruin and walking away from the wreckage. He turned then, his face ravaged, his eyes blazing with an emotion so fierce it took her breath away. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh, his touch not harsh but desperate. "Do you think I care about the land?" he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "Do you think I care about any of this without you?" She stared at him, speechless. "He can take the land, he can take the cattle, he can burn the house to the ground. It is all just dirt and wood." His eyes searched hers, pleading with her to understand. "I would rather lose the land than lose you, Clara." The words, so simple, so absolute, undid her. No one had ever chosen her, not once in her entire life. She had always been the thing that was left behind, the person who was walked away from. The truth of his words, the sheer, staggering weight of them, broke through the last of her defenses. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a profound and painful gratitude. That night, sleep was a luxury neither of them could afford. They sat at the kitchen table, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove, the silence punctuated by the soft sounds of Hope sleeping in her crate nearby. They were waiting. They did not know for what, but the air was electric with a sense of impending violence. It came just after midnight, a frantic whinny from the barn, followed by the terrified barking of the dog. Buck, then a faint, flickering orange glow began to dance against the kitchen window. "Fire!" Gideon breathed, the word a curse, He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle from the wall. "Stay in the house! Lock the door behind me! Do not come out, no matter what you hear!" He was gone before she could argue, a dark shape swallowed by the night. Clara ran to the window. The glow was brighter now, a hungry, terrible orange that licked at the dark sky. The barn. Bryce had made good on his threat. Panic seized her, cold and paralyzing. But then she heard it again, the terrified, high-pitched screaming of the horses, trapped in the burning structure. Apollo, the old mare, Daisy. Her paralysis broke, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so fierce it made her dizzy. She could not just stand here. Those were living creatures. That was Gideon's livelihood. She looked at the sleeping baby, a small, innocent island of peace in the growing chaos. She had to protect this. All of it. Ignoring Gideon's command, she unbolted the door and ran outside. The heat from the barn hit her like a physical blow, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning hay and wood. The front of the barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring wall of fire that reached for the stars. The main doors were impassable. She remembered the small side door, near the back, leading into the stalls. She ran, her thin nightgown catching on thorns, her bare feet stumbling on the rocky ground. As she rounded the corner, she saw them, 2 figures, their faces obscured by dark bandanas, silhouetted against the fire. They were splashing oil from a can onto the side of the barn, trying to spread the blaze. In the distance, she could hear the sound of a struggle, a grunt of pain, the crack of Gideon's rifle. He was occupied. He could not help her. For a moment, she froze. These were men, violent men. Her every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to cower in the dark. But then she heard the horses again, their panicked screams tearing at her heart. She thought of Gideon, fighting alone. She thought of the cradle he had started to build, the one she was not supposed to have seen yet, a half-finished symbol of a future these men were trying to turn to ash. Something inside her, something that had been dormant for a very long time, ignited. It was a cold, hard rage. She would not run. Not this time. She looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on the wood pile. The axe, no, too heavy, too clumsy. Then she saw it, lying on a workbench just inside the open door of the small tack room. Gideon's spare pistol, an old Colt he kept for emergencies. She had seen him clean it. She had never touched a gun in her life. She did not think. She acted. She snatched the gun. It was heavy, alien in her hand. The men had their backs to her, intent on their work. She raised the pistol with both hands, her arms shaking so violently she could barely aim. "Get away from there!" she yelled, her voice a reedy, unfamiliar sound in the roaring night. The men spun around, their faces showing surprise, then amusement when they saw her, a lone woman in a white nightgown, a ghost in the firelight, holding a gun that seemed too big for her. One of them laughed, a low, ugly sound. He took a step toward her. "Go on home, little lady. This ain't your concern." "I said, get away," she repeated, her voice stronger now. The man kept coming. He was close now. She could see the cruel glint in his eyes above the bandana. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a roar that seemed to tear the world apart. The recoil slammed her shoulder, knocking her back a step. When she opened her eyes, the man was on the ground, clutching his leg, screaming a litany of curses. The other man stared, his eyes wide with shock, then turned and fled into the darkness. Clara stood there, the gun hanging limply at her side, her ears ringing. She was trembling from head to foot, a violent, uncontrollable shaking. But she was standing. She had not run. The sound of the shot brought Gideon running. He saw the man on the ground, saw Clara standing over him, and his face was a mixture of terror and awe. Without a word, he grabbed a bucket and began a frantic, hopeless battle against the flames, while Clara, her mind blessedly numb, ran to the side door and fought with the latch. It was hot to the touch, But she finally wrenched it open and plunged into the smoke-filled barn, her one thought to get the horses out. The days that followed were a blur of ash and exhaustion. The barn was a loss, a blackened, skeletal ruin that smelled of smoke and defeat. But the horses were safe. The house was safe. They were safe. The man Clara had shot was now in the custody of the town marshal, a sullen, tight-lipped cowhand who refused to say who had hired him. But everyone knew. The story of the fire, and of Clara's role in it, spread through town like a wildfire of its own. When Gideon and Clara next rode in for supplies, the atmosphere was entirely different. The sneers and whispers were gone, replaced by nods of grudging respect. Men who had leered at her now tipped their hats. Women who had scorned her now looked at her with a new, curious light in their eyes. The woman they had dismissed as a hired saloon girl had risked her life to save her home. She had faced down armed men. She was not who they thought she was. Mrs. Gable, one of the women who had been so cruel in the general store, approached her, her face a mixture of embarrassment and admiration. "That was a brave thing you did, Mrs. Kane," she said, her voice quiet. Clara, surprised, could only nod in thanks. She found an unexpected ally in the town's schoolteacher, a prim, intelligent woman named Abigail Albright. Miss Albright sought her out, expressing her admiration and offering her friendship. For the first time, Clara confided in another woman, telling her a small, edited piece of her story. She found that sharing the burden, even a small part of it, made it lighter. When Miss Albright mentioned that the school could use another pair of hands to teach the younger girls to sew, Clara offered to help, her voice shy but hopeful. She was slowly, cautiously, becoming a part of this community, weaving herself into the fabric of the town she had once feared. She was no longer just Gideon Kane's hired wife. She was Clara Kane, the woman who had saved the horses, the woman who was going to teach their children. One evening, she came into the house after putting the chickens away and stopped dead in the doorway. Gideon was sitting by the fire, his back to her. In his lap was a piece of pine wood, and with his one good hand, he was carefully, lovingly, sanding it smooth. On the floor beside him were the other pieces of a nearly finished cradle. It was simple and sturdy, made with the unadorned, honest craftsmanship he put into everything he built. He had been working on it in secret, a quiet testament to his acceptance, to his hope for their future. Clara stood in the shadows, her hand pressed to her mouth. She watched as he worked, his brow furrowed in concentration, his movements slow but sure. He was building a home for the child they had saved, a safe place for her to sleep. He was building a home for them. Silent tears began to stream down her face. They were not tears of grief or of fear. They were tears of a deep, overwhelming, and utterly unfamiliar joy. He did not hear her. She backed away quietly, leaving him to his work, and went outside to cry under the vast, silent, star-dusted sky. The cradle Gideon built for hope became the quiet heart of the house. It sat by the fire, a testament to a future they had not dared to speak of, but were now building with their own hands. A fragile sense of peace settled over the ranch, the kind of peace that comes after a long and brutal storm. The blackened skeleton of the barn stood as a constant reminder of the violence that lurked at the edges of their world. But inside the small, sturdy house, a family was taking root in the ashes. This peace was a delicate thing, easily broken. It was shattered not by the roar of fire, but by the quiet, official knock on the door a month later. It was Marshal Thompson, a stoic, weary man who carried the weight of the law on his stooped shoulders. He did not look happy to be there. In his hand, he held a legal summons. Nathan Bryce had abandoned the path of brute force for the more insidious weapon of the law. He had filed a formal claim on the northern pasture, and the summons was for a hearing before a circuit judge who would be passing through redemption in 2 weeks' time. "On what grounds?" Gideon asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stood in the doorway, blocking the marshal's view of Clara. who was holding hope inside. The marshal had the grace to look uncomfortable. "He has produced a deed, Gideon, signed by your father, years ago. It claims the land was collateral for a personal loan that was never repaid. My father never borrowed a cent from that man in his life. He despised him," Gideon said, his voice laced with contempt. "The signature is a forgery." "That may be," the marshal said with a sigh. "But it is a good one. And Bryce has a witness, a drifter who claims he saw your father sign it. It will be the judge's job to sort it out. I am just the man who delivers the mail." He tipped his hat, a gesture of apology, and rode away, leaving the white paper in Gideon's hand. It felt heavier than a stone. The summons was a cloud that blotted out the sun. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by a tense, gnawing anxiety. A forged deed, a paid liar for a witness. It was a simple, ugly strategy, but an effective one. In the eyes of an impartial judge from back east, it might look like a simple business dispute. It would be Bryce's word, the word of a wealthy and powerful man, against Gideon's. Despair began to settle over the house like a fine layer of dust. They had no proof, nothing but the conviction of their own truth, and in a court of law. That was often not enough. Gideon spent his days pacing, his face a grim, thunderous mask. Clara felt a familiar, cold dread creeping back into her heart. It seemed that every time she found a small patch of solid ground, it turned to quicksand beneath her feet. One rainy afternoon, while Gideon was out mending a fence on the southern pasture, Clara was trying to bring some order to the house, as if tidying the physical space could somehow tidy the chaos in her mind. She was dusting the bookshelf in the main room, a task she had put off for weeks. Her fingers traced the worn leather spines of Gideon's father's books, histories, almanacs, collections of Shakespeare. At the end of the shelf was a large, heavy book that was different from the others. It was a family Bible, its black leather cover cracked and faded with age. A place of reverence, a book that had been left untouched since Sarah's death. Clara hesitated, feeling like an intruder, but something compelled her. She gently lifted the heavy volume from the shelf and carried it to the table. She opened it carefully. The first few pages were filled with family records, written in different hands. A spidery script for Gideon's grandparents, a stronger, more elegant hand for his parents. Births, marriages, deaths. A history of the Kane family, written in faded brown ink. She saw Gideon's name and the date of his birth, and below it, Sarah's name, her birth and marriage dates recorded in her own graceful handwriting. The date of her death had been added by Gideon, the script stark and clumsy, as if his hand had been shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. Clara felt a pang of sorrow for the woman she had never known. The woman whose ghost still lingered in the quiet corners of this house. She was about to close the book when she noticed that the pages in the middle seemed thicker than the rest. A faint line, almost invisible, suggested something had been slipped between them. Her heart began to beat a little faster. With trembling fingers, she carefully parted the pages. Tucked deep within the book of Psalms was a folded piece of oilskin. She unfolded it on the table. Inside were 2 items. The first was a hand-drawn map. It was old and yellowed, drawn with a precise, steady hand. It showed the original survey of the Kane property, dated 30 years prior. A small, clear notation, signed and dated by the territorial surveyor, marked the location of the deep well. It was situated firmly, undeniably, in the center of the Kane ranch. A full half-mile from the property line Bryce now claimed. The second item was a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written in Sarah's elegant script. Clara's hands shook as she read it. "My dearest Gideon, if you are reading this, it means that Nathan Bryce has finally made his move, and I am no longer here to stand with you against him. He has been coveting our northern pasture for years. He speaks of it with a hunger in his eyes that frightens me. Your father once told me that Bryce tried to cheat him in a cattle deal, and he never trusted him again. Bryce is a man who believes the world owes him whatever he has the cunning to take. I found this old survey map in your father's papers. I have hidden it here. Do not trust the official records at the courthouse. Bryce has friends in low places, and I fear he would not hesitate to have the records altered. This is our proof, our truth. Keep it safe. Do not let that man take what is ours, what is yours. Fight for this land. It is your legacy. Yours always, Sarah. Clara stared at the letter, her vision blurring with tears. It was a voice from the grave, a final, desperate act of love and protection from a woman who had lost her own hope, but had still tried to secure her husband's future. Sarah had seen the darkness in Nathan Bryce long before any of them. She had given them the weapon they needed to fight him. When Gideon returned, soaked from the rain, his face etched with weariness, she was waiting for him at the table. She said nothing. She simply pushed the map and the letter across the wooden surface. He read the letter, his one good hand braced on the table, his knuckles white. He read it once, and then again. A muscle worked in his jaw. The look on his face was a complex mixture of grief, gratitude, and a slow, burning rage. He looked at the map, his finger tracing the lines his father had walked, the location of the well that was his birthright. She knew, he said, his voice thick with emotion. All this time she knew what he was. For a moment, a fierce, triumphant hope flared between them. They had it. They had the proof. Bryce's lies would crumble in the face of this undeniable truth. But then, a new, colder reality began to set in. To present this in court, Clara said slowly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. The person who found it will have to testify. They will have to swear an oath. Gideon looked at her, the hope in his eyes dying, replaced by a dawning horror. He understood. They will ask my name, Clara continued, her voice barely a whisper. My real name. I cannot testify as Clara Kane. It would be perjury. I will have to say I am Clara Wynne, and Bryce, his lawyer, will ask why I am living in your house, under your name. The whole story will come out. The deal, the payment. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to say the rest of it. Bryce said he would have my past investigated. He will have found it by now, the court record, from when I was a teenager, when I was arrested. Gideon's face was pale. Arrested for what? She could not look at him. She stared at her hands, clasped tightly on the table. For stealing, she whispered. I stole a loaf of bread. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain against the window panes. I was 15. She said, her voice a dead monotone. My mother was sick. We had not eaten in 2 days. I was caught. I spent a night in a jail cell. It is on my record. A criminal. That is what they will call me in that courtroom. A hired woman and a thief. They will not believe a word I say. They will say I forged the letter myself. Gideon came around the table and knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. His face was a mask of anguish. Then you will not do it, he said, his voice fierce. We will not use it. I will not let you go through that. I will not let them humiliate you, shame you. I will not let that happen. She looked at him then, at the desperate sincerity in his eyes. He meant it. He would lose his home, his legacy, everything his family had built to protect her. The enormity of his sacrifice, of his love, was a staggering, beautiful, and terrible thing. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. The woman who had spent her life running, the woman who had hidden in the shadows, who had flinched from the judgment of others, was gone. In her place was a woman who had faced down fire and armed men, a woman who had held a dying baby and given her a name, a woman who was loved by a good man. She would not let that man lose everything for her. She pulled her hands from his and stood up, her back straight, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. Yes, I will, she said, her voice quiet but clear and steady. "I will testify. I will not let him win. I will not let him take this from you. I will not run away. Not this time." The day of the hearing, the town saloon was packed. It had been converted into a makeshift courtroom, and every person who could get away from their work was there, their faces a sea of morbid curiosity. The air was hot and close, smelling of sawdust and stale beer and the nervous sweat of the crowd. When Clara and Gideon walked in, a low murmur rippled through the room. People shifted in their seats to get a better look. Clara could feel their stares, 100 tiny needles on her skin. She held hope in her arms, a small, warm anchor in a sea of hostility. Gideon walked beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back, a silent, steadying presence. They took their seats at a table near the front. Nathan Bryce was already at the opposite table, looking smug and confident, whispering to a slick, well-dressed lawyer from Cheyenne. The judge was a stern, white-haired man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The proceedings began. Bryce's lawyer presented the forged deed with a flourish. His paid witness, a man with shifty eyes and a nervous tic, told his well-rehearsed lies. It all sounded plausible, damning. Clara could feel the mood in the room shifting, the silent jury of her neighbors finding them guilty. Then it was their turn. Gideon's lawyer, a young, earnest man from town, called Clara to the stand. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. "State your name for the court," the lawyer said. Clara took a deep breath. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, at the women who had sneered at her, at the men who had leered. Then she looked at Gideon. He was watching her, his face pale, his eyes full of a love so fierce it gave her strength. "My name is Clara Wynne," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent room. A collective gasp went through the crowd. She saw Bryce smile, a wolf's smile. This was what he had been waiting for. His lawyer was on his feet in an instant. "Objection! The witness is representing herself as Clara Kane, the defendant's wife." "I will explain, Your Honor," Clara said, looking directly at the judge. And she did. She told them everything. The arrangement, the payment, the agreement for one night. She left nothing out. She told them why she had done it, the poverty, the desperation. Then she told them about the fire, about the baby, about tearing up the annulment papers. She did not ask for their pity or their approval. She simply stated the facts of her life. Bryce's lawyer began his cross-examination, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So, you are a woman who was paid for her services, Miss Wynne. A woman who entered into a fraudulent marriage for money?" "I am a woman who was hungry," Clara replied, her gaze unwavering. "And is it not true, Miss Wynne, that this is not your first brush with the law? Is it not true that you have a criminal record? That you were convicted of theft?" This was the moment, the final, killing blow he had been saving. The crowd stirred, whispering. "Yes," Clara said, her voice calm. "That is true. When I was 15 years old, my mother was sick and we were starving. I stole a loaf of bread. I am not ashamed of it. I am not proud of it, but it is a part of my story." She looked out at the faces of the townspeople. She saw Mrs. Gable, whose own children were always well-fed and well-clothed. She saw Martha Swanson, who knew what it was to be a woman alone, struggling to survive. And she saw their expressions changing. The judgment was fading, replaced by a reluctant, dawning understanding. "And now," she said, turning back to the judge, "I would like to tell you the story of another woman, a woman named Sarah Kane." She presented the Bible. She showed the judge the hidden map and read Sarah's letter aloud. The room was utterly silent. Sarah's words, her love for her husband, her fear of Nathan Bryce, filled the stuffy saloon, a powerful, unimpeachable testament from the grave. When she was finished, there was a long, profound silence. The judge stared at the map, then at the letter, then at Nathan Bryce, whose smug confidence had evaporated. replaced by a pale, sickly sheen of sweat. The judge's gavel came down with a crack that made everyone jump. This court finds the deed presented by Mr. Bryce to be a blatant and malicious forgery, he declared, his voice booming. The Kane family's claim to their land is upheld. Furthermore, based on the evidence in this letter and recent testimony regarding an arson attempt on the Kane property, I am ordering the marshal to take Mr. Bryce into custody on suspicion of fraud and attempted arson. Chaos erupted. Bryce lunged to his feet, protesting, but the marshal was already there, clamping a heavy hand on his shoulder. The crowd was on its feet, everyone talking at once. But Clara and Gideon saw none of it. They only saw each other. Gideon was staring at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and overwhelming pride. He was looking at her as if he had never truly seen her before, not as the broken woman he had hired, not as the grieving mother he had comforted, but as the strong, fierce, and honorable woman who had just saved them all. He saw her, whole and complete, and he was in awe. They rode back to the ranch in silence, Hope sleeping peacefully in a basket between them. The setting sun cast long shadows across the plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. It was a silence born not of tension but of reverence for the magnitude of what had just happened. That night, after Hope was asleep in her cradle, they stood on the porch, looking up at the star-dusted sky. The air was cool and clean. "We are not the same people who made that deal in the saloon," Clara said softly, her voice full of wonder. Gideon turned to her. He took her hand, his rough palm warm and steady against hers. He brought it to his lips and kissed it gently. "No," he replied, his voice husky. "We are better." The victory in the makeshift courtroom did not bring noisy celebration. It brought a deep, quiet exhale, the kind that follows a long illness or a near escape from death. The air on the ranch, once thick with tension, was now clean and light. The future, which had been a terrifying, formless fog, began to take on the clear, solid shape of the surrounding hills. A few days after the hearing, Clara was in her room, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, when she unpacked the last of her meager possessions from her worn carpet bag. At the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of muslin, was a length of blue cotton fabric she had bought with the last of her sewing money before leaving for Wyoming. It was the color of a spring sky after a week of rain, a color of impossible hope. She had saved it for a dress she never thought she would have the occasion to wear. Now, with a quiet determination, she set to work. Her needle, once a tool of desperate survival, became an instrument of creation. She worked in the evenings, by the light of the fire, the soft snip of her scissors and the whisper of thread through fabric becoming a new, peaceful sound in the house. When the dress was finished, she put it on. It was simple, unadorned with the lace or ruffles she had once sewn for others, but it fit her perfectly. The stitching was fine and even, a testament to her skill. The blue of the cotton brought out the color of her eyes, which were no longer haunted and weary, but clear and calm. She looked at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror on her wall and saw not the ghost of Clara Wynne, but the woman she was becoming. Gideon saw her as he came in from the fields, his face dusty and tired. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her. He had seen her in a thin gray dress, shivering in the wind. He had seen her in a borrowed coat, her face smudged with ash. He had seen her in a simple work dress, her brow furrowed with worry. But he had never seen her like this. The setting sun caught the blue of her dress, making it seem to glow. She stood tall, her shoulders back, a quiet confidence in her posture that had not been there before. He did not move for a long moment. A slow, wondering smile touched his lips, a smile that reached all the way to his stormy gray eyes, chasing the shadows away. "Clara," he said, his voice soft and full of a quiet awe. "You are beautiful." The words, spoken so simply, so honestly, landed in her heart not with a flutter, but with a profound and settling warmth. It was the first time in her life she truly believed it. They began to build a real home together. It was a slow, deliberate process, a partnership of hands and hearts. Gideon, his arm now fully healed, began to build new shutters for the windows. He worked with a patient, focused energy, the rhythmic rasp of his plane a steady beat against the quiet of the afternoons. He said they were to keep out the winter wind, but Clara knew they were for more than that. They were a symbol of permanence, of a desire to protect and enclose the life they were building within these walls. Clara, in turn, started a garden. In the rich, dark earth behind the house, she tilled the soil, her hands sinking into the dirt with a feeling of profound satisfaction. She planted rows of beans and squash, carrots and potatoes, practical, life-sustaining things. But at the edge of the plot, near the porch, she planted a small packet of wildflower seeds that Abigail Albright had given her. It was a frivolous, hopeful act, a belief in a future that would have time for beauty. They were putting down roots, both in the soil and in each other. They worked with the unspoken knowledge that they were creating a place for hope to one day run, a safe harbor in a wide and often unforgiving world. One afternoon, the mail carrier made his weekly stop, leaving a small bundle of letters and a newspaper on the porch. Among them was a letter for Clara. The handwriting on the envelope was elegant and unfamiliar, the postmark from a town in Ohio she had not thought of in a decade. It was from her older sister, Eleanor. She took the letter into the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly. She had not heard from her sister since the day she had been cast out of her family home, a disgraced girl of 17. She sat at the table and slit the envelope open. The letter was full of remorse and regret. Eleanor wrote that their parents were gone now, and that she had spent years wishing she had been braver, wishing she had stood up for her younger sister. She asked for forgiveness. She asked Clara to come home. 10 years ago, this letter would have been everything. It would have been a lifeline, a reprieve. Now, the words felt like they were written in a foreign language, about a life that belonged to someone else. The past was a ghost, and she was no longer haunted by it. She looked around the quiet kitchen, at the sturdy table Gideon had built, at the new curtains she had sewn for the window, at the cradle sleeping soundly by the hearth. She thought of Gideon, out in the field, his presence a steady, comforting weight in her world. This was her home now. This was her family. She walked to the cook stove and opened the small iron door. The fire inside was burning low. She held the letter over the flames for a long moment. Then she let it go. She watched as the paper curled, the words of a past life turning black and then to ash. She felt no anger, no sadness, only a quiet, profound sense of peace. She had already been forgiven. She had already come home. The spring deepened, turning the plains a vibrant, impossible green. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new life. One morning, just after dawn, Gideon found Clara on the porch, holding Hope on her hip. The baby was pointing a chubby finger at the rising sun, a look of solemn wonder on her face. They stood in silence for a while, watching the world wake up. "Clara," Gideon said, his voice quiet. She turned to him. The morning light caught in his hair, and his face was open and serious. He took a deep breath, like a man about to dive into deep water. "Marry me," he said. The words were simple, unadorned. Not for the land, not for appearances, not as part of a deal. Marry me for real. Be my wife. He was not kneeling. He held no ring. He just stood before her, his heart in his eyes, offering her the one thing he had left to give: himself. Everything they had been through, every silent understanding, every shared sorrow, was in that simple, honest question. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Hope gurgled happily in her arms, reaching out a hand to touch Gideon's cheek. Clara smiled, a radiant, watery smile that transformed her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Gideon, I will." Their wedding was nothing like the first. They held it on a Sunday, in the small clapboard church in town. This time, they walked through the front doors, and this time, they were not alone. The church was nearly full. Martha Swanson was there, her 2 young sons scrubbed clean and sitting beside her. Abigail Albright sat in the front pew, her face beaming. Mr. Abernathy from the general store was there, along with his wife. Even Mrs. Gable, the town's former gossip, was in attendance, and she gave Clara a small, respectful nod as they walked down the aisle. They were surrounded not by the silence of judgment, but by the quiet hum of a community that had seen their struggle, had witnessed their character, and had chosen to embrace them. They stood before Reverend Michael, holding hands. Hope was in Martha's arms, watching the proceedings with wide, curious eyes. When Gideon spoke his vows, his voice was a low, steady rumble, a promise not just of love, but of unwavering protection and partnership. When Clara spoke hers, her voice was clear and true, a promise of a home, of a shared life, of a love that had grown in the hardest of soils. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, a warm, genuine round of applause filled the small church. Gideon leaned down and kissed her, a real kiss, full of love and promise. And in that moment, in the warmth of the sun streaming through the church windows, they were truly, finally, irrevocably married. That night, back at the ranch, a deep and profound peace settled over the house. A gentle fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow over the room. Hope was sleeping soundly in her cradle, her little chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The wind, which had once howled around the eaves like a hungry beast, now whispered through the pines, a soft, melodic song in the distance. Clara came to stand beside Gideon at the fireplace. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They stood in a comfortable silence, watching the flames. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Just one night?" she said, her voice a soft, wondering whisper. "That is what I said to you in the saloon." Gideon smiled, a slow, gentle curve of his lips. He looked down at her, his eyes full of a love so deep it seemed to have no end. "Neither of us slept," he replied. He tilted her chin up and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that was a culmination of everything they had survived. It was a kiss of shared memory and future promise, of a love that had been forged in the fire and had come out stronger than steel. She leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, under the vast, silent Wyoming sky, surrounded by the quiet symphony of the night. Clara no longer trembled. She was anchored. She had a life to nurture, a home to protect, and a man who would stand with her against any storm. She had a family, and she was, at long last, safe. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.